I'm going to have a minute or a minute and a half opening statement. I tell you what, let me just, before we do that, let me just make sure you understand what's here, and then it's pretty clear, I think. But first of all, so this is an update. This is the budget as passed based on a forecast of just 6 months ago. And this is the new forecast. The purple line is the line we've been on. This is if the current trend continues. And so this is just enough for you to notice that the forecast, although it's $3 billion off of a year ago and $1.8 billion off of just 6 months ago, is calling for improvement over what we're experiencing. So I mean, we hope that that's right. But this is the current trend. So this latest forecast, as radically different as it is, does say that things will get better. And let's hope that's right. Over here, and this is really more discussion for later, but it's very, very important. So this is the new forecast, and that's how much money we'd have in the year 2011, the fiscal year 2011. And the reason it's here is to show you that the state would be starting the next budget cycle with less money than it had in 10, 9, 8, 7, or 6. So you'd be stepping back 6 years in time. And the base of spending in the state government cannot be growing while the base of revenue is 6 years, has moved backward 6 years. That's really something we'll be discussing on future occasions, but you remember that just talk about the cliff and not falling off a cliff. Well, according to the new forecast, that's even a little more severe, but that's the next budget issue. So, everybody got what those are? Let me just give you a quick statement then. For over a year, I've cautioned that the revenue forecast used by the legislature seemed too rosy and out of touch with the severity of the national recession. Today, the forecasters face the reality we've been dealing with every day. If we'd done nothing since the budget passed in June, the state's reserves would have been gone next summer. Of course, we have acted, but if we do nothing further, we'll run through every penny of our reserves and still have $300 million in bills we can't pay by the end of this budget in 2011. In other words, the debate over the reserves is over. We are using them. The only question is whether we'll use every penny of them or find a way to have something left. And that's if this forecast finally is correct, where the others were so incredibly wrong. We've already cut state agencies by 20% and higher ed by 6%. We're now forced to our last resort. K-12 spending is half the entire state budget, and it will have to contribute something to keeping us in the black. I've asked the State Board of Education to meet quickly and recommend how much reduction can be absorbed without reducing the number of classroom teachers. I've also asked their guidance on steps superintendents, school boards, and teachers themselves can take to prevent layoffs. Their recommendations are due by Friday. Our situation in Indiana remains far more manageable than most states. 39 of them have already cut education, and many are preparing to do so again. We still have reserves to draw on, while many of theirs are long gone. If all parties will accept a part in helping out, we'll get through whatever is left of this recession and come out the other side sooner and stronger than most.
Are we talking a cut in education or just a reduction in the increase?
We will need at least, as you can see here, at least $300 million. And that's simply to try to get to the end of the budget at a zero reserve. So it will require some reduction. The question is how much.
And are you saying that you will need $300 million from K-12 education?
That's right. At least.
Could you repeat, you said you asked for recommendations by Friday. From what all groups do you want their recommendation on? Just the State Board of Education, or do you want to hear from all the schools?
Well, I think the Board of Ed is going to take testimony and will welcome as many people as it can accommodate. But we're going to want to hear from them quickly.
So are you willing to finish the biennium with a balance of zero?
I think that would be very foolhardy. First of all, nobody's that accurate as the legislature's forecasts have made clear. And so our goal certainly will be to end with some cushion. Clearly won't be $1 billion. We're going to have to take very bold action to make sure there's any at all, but we will.
What is the bottom line that you would feel comfortable with?
Well, as you know, I wanted to try to get there with at least $1 billion. Now, that's just not going to be practical unless there's a very positive surprise after would have been an unending string of negative surprises, at least to those folks. And so we'll be aiming to have some reserves left over, and we'll see what's possible.
Are you confident that this forecast is more accurate given the fact that they're doing the numbers and crunching them differently this time?
Well, it couldn't be any less accurate. And they missed by $3 billion just a year ago and $1.8 billion just 6 short months ago. I recall many, many times saying this can't be right, it doesn't match the reality we see. Many of our opponents, I think wishfully, imagined that perhaps we were being too pessimistic. It's one of those times when I'd like to have been wrong, but unfortunately not.
Is there an amount that the state simply needs on hand for simple cash flow purposes?
I'll refer you to Ryan about this. I think we can. The answer is you're clearly better off with some balance for that purpose.
If schools do not voluntarily come up with ways to cut their spending, should the legislature reopen the budget when they're in here in January and do something about school funding?
No, we can reduce the spending, and now, although we wish we didn't have to, we'll do so. The question is how to do this when 39 cents of the school dollar, as I've so often pointed out, is spent outside the classroom. There's really no justification for teacher layoffs, except in districts that are shrinking and have fewer kids to teach, or for performance reasons. But there are so many things that our schools could do, and now's the time for leadership. Now's the time for statesmanship in the interest of children.
Do you have recommendations for them, or you just want to come up with?
That's what I've asked the Board of Ed for. They're more expert than I. There are lots of things that have been suggested, and that some progressive schools have already done. But I hope the Board of Ed will come forward with as full a list as possible, and including things that maybe the state can do to help. For instance, we've already offered to bring them in under our procurement contracts. We think we get the best price around on things that schools buy in large quantities. They're welcome to come into our health insurance plan, which is much less expensive than many of theirs. Maybe there's some other things we can also do. We'll do all we can. The goal should be to manage through this with no reduction in classroom teachers, no increase in class size.
Are you still opposed to delayed payments?
Yes. That's very unfair to schools. By the way, it's happening all over America right now, but we cleaned that issue up in Indiana, and I don't want to go back to it.
So what you're asking the board to do, the Board of Education, is to come up with a way other than, for instance, just an across the board. You're not really looking at it across the board, everybody gets 5% less.
Not sure of that, Leslie. In other words, my own instinct is that we should stay with the formula that the legislature chose, and so that whatever reduction is made would be shared evenly. If the board has a different point of view, I'd like to hear it. But no, what I want to know is how much might the K-12 contribute to the goal of keeping Indiana solvent without tax increases, and what are all the ways they can think of that this can be done without teacher reductions.
But it sounds like you've already decided that $300 million is what you need from K-12.
No, the facts say that's a minimum.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But, so you're saying $300 million is a minimum, but it's the minimum.
Yes, I mean, $300 million on this forecast would bring us to a point where all the reserves were gone, we had nothing to start the next budget with. And that's cutting it way too close for comfort. And since we've already gone so deeply, we'll keep looking in other areas. But we will need, in my judgment, to find more than that, unless there's a very sudden reversal and a happy surprise on the revenue side. Let me remind everyone that at our suggestion, the budget includes a trigger for education that said if revenues were surprising on the upside, we would automatically give $1 out of 2 to education. Unfortunately, revenues have been very disappointing on the downside. And so when it amounts to half the whole budget, there's simply no avoiding the fact that there'll have to be some contribution. Far less than half, but some contribution to closing the gap.
Given this,
this is a quick deadline for turnaround on the recommendations. Are you looking to make cuts next month or February or?
Well, I want to get the recommendations first, but I think the schools deserve to know. I know that Superintendent Bennett has been visiting with them. They understand that this is very probable, probably going to be necessary, and the feedback I think I've heard is that they'd like some certainty and clarity sooner rather than later, so that's one reason to move quickly.
given this situation, is there any justification for any teacher getting a raise in the next year?
I'd like the Board Ed to talk about that. The data I've seen says that in a year in which the average Hoosier income went down 2.5%, the average teacher salary will go up more than 4%. And so this may be among the things the Board wants to speak to. But I would hope that everyone can embrace the goal of keeping teachers on the job, keeping classrooms as small as possible, and using any tool that might be available to accomplish that.
What you've done so far has been doable by executive order. Is this going to require the legislature's approval?
No, not in our opinion.
Hasn't this money been appropriated?
So was the rest.
They appropriated it to you to spend, but doesn't this go directly to the schools? And
No, it passes through the state budget as any other expenditure, and clearly comes under the flexibility that the legislature gave us. I mean, let's take note of this. If, as some of us suspected at the time, the revenue forecast of June let me start over. The revenue forecast of June was, as some of us suspected, inflated. If the legislature had been looking at this forecast then, they would have appropriated far less money. They would not have voted to wipe out all the reserves and leave bills unpaid besides. And so we're simply doing now what I think they would have done if they'd had better information 6 months ago.
Do you have other plans for cuts in addition to K through 12 schools? Are there other things within your purview, within the administration you're planning to cut?
We are looking every day, and you know that K-12 is our last resort, which by definition means that we continue to want to make any adjustments anywhere else but there. So yes, we are. There are some things we have identified that for which we don't have the flexibility because of certain language in statute, and I do plan to take to the legislature a bill that would allow us to make some further reductions that we cannot make on our own right now.
Do you know how much in reductions you'll be asking the General Assembly to consider?
Not yet, but it's not nearly enough to close this gap.
And what areas are those in?
Well, I'll give you one example because we've looked at it before, but if we were allowed to manage the two public retirement funds as one, the funds would be separate, nothing would change for a beneficiary, but simply to get the volume of scale, reduce management fees and administrative costs, we think there's some real money in that. And that's an example of something that will be in that bill. If we had permission to do that, we could save more money in the core functions of government.
Have you given the Board of Education a list of things you want them to consider, or do you want them to just kind of start from scratch?
Yeah, well, I don't consider it from scratch, because most of these things have been talked about a long time. Many, I would hope, would be familiar to you and most citizens by now, as about the reduction of overhead and duplicate administration, combining for procurement, but they may have additional insights and ideas that I haven't thought of.
And it sounds like these would be things that that the board would be telling schools, here are ways for you
Yeah.
to save money, to accommodate these cuts. But will you be able to order any schools to do any of these things?
Not in any way I know, but you're exactly right. I mean, our purpose here will be to say that although as regrettable as it is, K-12, half the budget, will have to contribute something to getting us through this. And that we believe that ought not involve the layoff of a single teacher simply for financial reasons, that there are many, many more options, plenty enough to accommodate a modest reduction in their appropriation. And then we want to be as helpful as we can, but we can't make them do it.
And you're saying that's $300 million over the biennium?
Right.
And
Well,
even
what
if,
remains of it.
and even if you did that, you would still have to, without even more cuts, you would still have to significantly eat through the reserves,
All of them, Mike.
all of them.
I mean, if this were right, and no one imagines that this is right, we just hope it's much more correct than anything we've seen before. But if it's right, you'd be 800 million, you'd have eaten all your reserves. I mean, that debate is over. Yes, we're going to use the reserves. The question is, can we preserve some of them? Which I think is the only prudent course, especially when you'll be headed into a very, very tough budget cycle off of a low base like that. So, on this forecast, it would take at least 300 million. We've done about 500 so far. Take at least 300 million to arrive at the end of the budget cycle at zero. And that's cutting it too close for comfort, and might not be enough based on history.
I think they said at the budget committee meeting that revenues will have to improve over the next 6 months just to meet this bad forecast.
Yes.
I wondered what you see as the worst case scenario when you lay awake at night.
I don't know worse, but that's why I brought you this chart today. We've been, this is the trend rate that we've been on. And so the new forecast, is sobering as it is, suggests things will get better. It's roughly like this. We have been running so far 12% below last year. The new to meet the new forecast, we'll have to run within 3% of last year. We'll see. But that's why 300 is a minimum figure, because we're not going to bet the state's AAA credit rating on that being accurate or as bad as things may be.
And has there been any discussion at this point of raising taxes?
No.
Any additional state layoffs?
We'll see. All the departments, remember, they're going for 20%, not whatever small percentage we may come to here, but 20%. And they're having to do some very, very difficult things.
Do you know what the total number of layoffs is so far?
I don't. It's not that many so far, but we don't like any one of them. I'll just point out, I hope that people will react to this in a spirit of understanding and cooperation and can do. But I would say that if anyone doesn't, then they have an immediate responsibility. Tell us what taxes you want to raise and how much, because that's the only alternative. No more talk about reserves. They are already in the mix. Thank you.